Next, we come to a story about the origins of humanity, a headline that's irresistible in many respects. The ancestral home of all human beings discovered by scientists. And I'm always very wary of headlines that make complex things sound simple. But in this instance, it sounds like a compelling crossroads of lots of elements of humanity. It is a lush region which covered parts of what is now Namibia and Zimbabwe that was apparently home to an enormous lake and sustained our ancestors for 70,000 years, according to a paper published in Nature. Uh, it's interesting because this is dated between 110 and 130,000 years ago. So that's about 70,000 years, or maybe 170,000 years if we take into account the Moroccan skull that was found. It was late last year or earlier this year.
I
Um,
think so, yeah.
but essentially, it's either halfway through our time on this planet as a species, or it's about a third of the way in, or thereabouts. And it seems to be a stopping off point before Homo sapiens spread out across the world. And that's fine. I think it's interesting, and I think it's something else to be talked about. There's the use of mitochondrial DNA that's been deployed here to uh, prop up and extend this conversation. But for me, I hate to say it, as someone who did dabble in evolution in university in my first year in particular, I'd looked into it in quite a lot of depth, but then stepped back a little bit. I'm always struck by the risk of certain statements when it comes to human evolution. Because the slightest thing, like for example the Moroccan skull, can change everything. And actually, as was highlighted in the interview that I conducted with Patrice Desier of the Ancestors computer game recently, he looking in from the outside, from a computer game developer's perspective, sees this as therefore a live, in his words, a live science because it is so subject to change. Um, what what are your thoughts on this sort of story?
Right. Well, firstly, what is more compelling a story for archaeological research than the origins of all of us?
Hmm.
Uh,
Well, or
yeah.
indeed, a newspaper headline. It's like something from the 1930s.
Well,
Origins of all of us discovered in
and
deepest, darkest Africa.
that is the next point I was going to make. My first thought in when I see any kind of story like this, getting penetration across media outlets,
Hmm.
traditional press, traditional broadcasters across the internet. Uh, what that says to me is that the the comms teams at the various journals concerned uh, um, have done their job entirely properly and put out a press release flagging up this work to science journalists and so on, and in a way that makes it easy for them to sell the story to their editors.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Um, and that's what we've got here
Hmm.
in terms of the timing of it and the way it's been put forward. You know, it's a perfectly legitimate, evidence-based, peer-reviewed scientific journal that's being quoted.
Hmm.
Um, but it is also clear from the follow-up pieces and various forums and so on that have discussed this story that the conclusion that has been drawn by the team responsible for the work,
Hmm.
um, which has included people from the Garvin, Professor Vanessa Hayes, who's quoted here, from the Garvin Institute of Medical Research in Sydney, and there are other people involved in this too. It's a major project um, that put it this way, alternative views are available, and as I say, although it's come from a peer-reviewed journal, uh, it is not universally accepted as being a
Well, a straightforward story.
we'll put it this way, the hypothesis has been questioned.
Yeah. Well, but it's worthwhile saying that. So, in the case of Vanessa Hayes, Professor Hayes, she is saying that it's been clear that for some time, anatomically modern humans, which is the terminology used for people who are just like us, have been around since for around about 200,000 years or 300,000 years, or yeah, that roughly that amount of time. And in her question is what has been, or her question is rather, what has been long debated is the exact location of this emergence and subsequent dispersal of our earliest ancestors. But this sort of debate and criticism and critique extends slightly more extremely if we look elsewhere. So, for example, and this is quite pleasing to see. This is a Welsh spelling of a name, Hugh Grouchett, on Twitter, tweets seemingly quite powerfully. He's definitely got an opinion. Humans did not evolve in one small part of Africa. Be very wary of such claims. Be they from archaeology, fossil, or genetics. Simple headlines, bad science. And he tweets,
And we should say
well,
there that
I was
I was going to say that Hugh Grouchett is from the Max Planck Institute, highly regarded academic institution, and is a specialist in human evolution and the links between human evolution and extreme events such as
he
climate change and so on.
he
So just
is,
somebody coming from the field, not just
yeah.
sniping from the sidelines.
No, yeah, well, indeed, but and he tweets a largely unjustified diagram that actually even I can't quite fully grasp. I say even I, in so much as you say, I've got a bit of a background in this. I can't quite fully grasp exactly what he's getting at with some of these diagrams, and as a critique of what's been talked about in the press release and news story. So you have those sorts of criticisms, and then you have even more extreme criticisms in the shape of full-on multi-regional hypotheses of human evolution. Um, so you can, this idea of critiquing the idea that people came from one place as opposed to a
Yeah.
few similar places, to full on people came from different parts of the world and eventually merged into one roughly coalescent species. And a
I,
key
I,
a,
I you
well,
know what
a key proponent of that being someone like Milford Wolpoff,
yes.
who's sort of infamous in the field of evolution in that sense. Anyway, you were saying.
But you see, yeah, and I take all that on board. I'd step back even further though from just
Mm,
looking at the whether it's the single region evolutionary theory or the multi-region evolutionary theory for modern Homo sapiens.
mm,
Um, and I think it's worth quoting another specialist in the subject, Chris Stringer from the Natural History Museum,
mhm.
who is quoted in the Guardian article as questioning the actual tools that the team reporting um, on the African uh, uh, lake wetland story theory
Hmm.
have used. Stringer says, and it's in quote marks, I'm definitely cautious about using monogenetic distributions to infer exactly where ancestral populations were living 200,000 years ago, particularly in a continent as large and complex as Africa. That's because they've used uh, the mitochondrial DNA from tribes, native peoples who live in the area currently,
Hmm.
to assess the stability of population and so on.
Well, and
And then
crucial,
Stringer goes on to
well,
say,
crucially, according to the theory in the Independent article and in this Nature journal piece, it specifically says that first migrants ventured northeast, followed by a second wave of migrants who travelled southwest, and a third population remained in the homeland until today. So that's what Chris is getting at when he has concerns.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. But he goes on to say as well, like so many studies, and again, this is in quote marks, like
Mm,
so many studies that concentrate on one small bit of the genome, or one region, or one stone tool industry, or one, quote, critical fossil, it
mm,
cannot capture the full complexity of our mosaic origin, other
mm,
than once other data are considered.
mm, mm,
Um, we're back. We've discussed this so many times before on Watching Brief. Uh, if people, if our viewer looks back through the Watching Brief
mm,
archive
mm,
on YouTube, the number of times we've discussed uh, theories where ADNA is used as the magic bullet to solve
Well,
back in the
ADNA
50s. It
ADNA
was thought
being ancient DNA. So
ancient
so
DNA, yeah,
as opposed to a
yeah,
type of DNA,
or
because mitochondrial DNA is a type.
sorry,
And
yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah,
yeah,
sorry,
yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Just clarifying. Yep.
ancient DNA and DNA being used as the basis for a magic bullet theory.
Yeah.
And if we look back at the history of archaeology, back in the 1950s, dating, for example, the magic bullet was C14 dating, carbon
Hmm.
14 dating.
Hmm.
Then along came dendrochronology, which showed that C14 dating was, as it was then practiced, was in many cases highly inaccurate. And then you come to current practice where C14 dating calibrated against dendro, and with some very, very special mathematics.
Mm-hmm.
And you're now producing C14 dates with accuracy of decades,
Mm.
at
Mm.
4000 BCs.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, these things are always a cycle,
Mm.
and there's always a magic bullet, and the magic bullet is always somehow or other blunted. But then it gets reinterpreted, and the data stream is validated, but maybe in different ways to what it was first perceived as being valid.
Well,
So
and
I think we have to bear that in mind.
yeah, well, and inevitably DNA is useful. It's absolutely useful for medical practitioners,
It's an
and
incredible technology. It
yeah,
really is.
and it will be useful. It will continue to be useful in this field. But I suppose, as you say, it's that idea of it so you mentioned things like C14 dating, but I mean culturally, yeah, the atomic age. People were seeing the growth of access to things like uranium or whatever as being the cure all for everything. At one point it was put into pottery. It was a medicine. Well, not uranium,
There's the
but
famous apocryphal
radioactive elements.
story about the American farmer who contacted Los Alamos and said, "Have you got any of the? Can I borrow? Can I have one of your nuclear bombs? I've got a tree stump I'm trying to get rid of."
But yeah, precisely. It was it, and so there, there, there are things to be aware of and things to hold in
Yeah, yeah.
your head when you're thinking about this sort of news story. But I suppose the reason why I was eager to have this conversation was just to highlight that doesn't mean that one has to rush to the extreme and discount established notions of the out of Africa theory. The out of Africa isn't one person's idea, and it doesn't come from one piece of evidence. And so there are the various voices in this sort of debate, and especially when this sort of brash headline comes to the surface. But we need to be
Yeah.
careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think it
No,
is.
but I think what's interesting is there's a problem that's been highlighted in some of the other responses to this. And again, I'm quoting a couple of experts who were contacted uh, um, by the who are quoted in the Guardian again.
Hmm.
Um, Sarah Tishkoff, who's a geneticist from the University of Pennsylvania, told the Guardian, "How can they know there aren't old lineages in other regions if they're not included in the study? In other
Hmm.
words, that the study is too narrow to actually draw the conclusion that the team is concluding."
Hmm.
And then Rebecca Ackerman, who's an archaeologist at the University of Cape Town, said something which I think is perhaps the key to this, in that it highlights an issue which has been quoted in respect to other DNA stories,
Hmm.
which is that the teams involved haven't included moderation from archaeologists who are up to speed with the current state of evidence and research.
Hmm.
Because what Rebecca Ackerman says is drawing sweeping conclusions about place of origin from analysis of this tiny part of the modern genome is deeply problematic and outdated.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Well, yeah. Well,
Okay, that's only one person's
no, but
view, but it shows that. Go on.
no, I was going to say, well, but the thing is, and so I should just say for people at home, we're having a bit of trouble with the Skype connection here today. So just bear with us this month. But uh, in that sense, I think that is, even though that is one person's statement and opinion, it is highlighting something that is true of modern current thinking in science, and that is this idea that we're not looking for a sort of a modernist I the answer. These answers tend to be knitted together from much more complicated ideas and notions, and they are a tapestry. And often that tapestry will involve vast swathes of question marks. But the fact that we acknowledge those question marks
And in
and
fact, I think it's
we work with
worth
them is
saying that
important.
absolutely. I think it's worth saying, yeah, people aren't familiar. I wasn't so familiar with it until again doing some background reading for
Mm,
this for this segment. That there are now human evolutionary studies suggesting that parts of the element of the evolution of modern hominids,
Hmm.
us Homo sapiens, took place. The out of Africa theory is still broadly speaking accepted,
Hmm.
but it's now being suggested based on studies in other parts of the world, in Asia and Australia and so on, that evolution was taking place outside of Africa too.
Well, of course it was. Of course it
Yeah,
was.
exactly.
But
And that's not and that's not being taken into account by
no, no.
this kind of
Yeah.
story.
But also that doesn't mean that the full multi-regional hypothesis actually is true. It's one of those weird things
No,
where it's possible to
no.
have all of these mechanics and things occurring and still, broadly speaking, have a tail and a, a, a theory of humanity that is held up by various pieces of evidence. I suppose again, it's just the irony that we begin this conversation with a headline, and all we can do now is sort of say more or less. This is one of the reasons why I kind of stepped away from human evolution studies, is that we are poking around in the dark, and the idea that someone can just say, "I found it, I found the light switch," is essentially nonsense. It can't at this point cannot be done really.
And I think, and again, with my particular interest in the media and so on, I'll come back full circle to where we began as well by saying, I think this is a case study in why a uh, a clickbaity headline, which
Hmm.
is what it is actually,
Hmm.
um, on on a complex archaeological story, it might get the initial penetration in terms of audience reach
Hmm.
and the clicks, which is what the media outlets want.
Hmm.
Um, and if you want archaeological stories in the mainstream, that's how they have to be presented these days.
Hmm.
A headline, putting out a press release saying we've got this really complicated story about modern human evolution, and if you read all these authorities, you might get a broad overview. That ain't going to appear in the Guardian website.
No, no.
So
Indeed, indeed.